welcome. And I'm going to hand straight over to Paul Johanis at the Greenspace Alliance to welcome you this morning.
Bonjour, Monsieur, Madame. Merci d'avoir répondu à notre avis de presse. Le plan officiel populaire est une coalition d'une vingtaine d'organisations à but non lucratif qui sont préoccupées par le changement climatique et les questions connexes. So the People's Official Plan is a coalition of about 20 organizations, and that is focused on climate change, climate equity, and all related questions. So dealing with environmental sustainability, green spaces, greenhouse gas emissions, equity and social justice, transit, waste management, food security. So lots of different issues are all tied up together. We've examined closely the 2023 draft budget and in relation to these questions, and we'd like to share our conclusions and indicate what our expectations are of the budget that will be presented to Council on March 1st, so in a couple of days. So after this introduction, we have 6 speakers that will each address the 2023 budget from the point of view of their main preoccupation and give us their take and expectations. These will be brief comments, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So represented here today are the Federation of Citizens Associations, Ecology Ottawa, Greenspace Alliance, Community Associations for Environmental Sustainability, Ottawa Transit Riders, and Just Food. So we'll go in that order of presentations.
Thank you, Paul. My name is Roland Dorsay, and I'm a member of the board of the Federation of Citizens Associations of Ottawa and the chair of its External Relations Committee, which is principally focused on governance-related issues, and that's largely what I'm going to be speaking to about this morning. Our focus is, as Paul has said, on the budget and the budget-making process. We're focused on that largely because the budget affects people's lives. It's more than just about numbers. And it affects lives more so than probably any other policy document that the city produces annually. Unfortunately, the draft budget is a daunting read. Anybody who's tried to read it, I think, will recognize that fairly quickly. And so as a result, it gets much less attention than it deserves. And that needs fixing. And quite frankly, we're hoping that you can help us in that regard. By the time the public gets to see the budget, the draft budget, it's pretty much baked in. Notwithstanding efforts by the city to give people their say, the opportunities for meaningful public engagement are few and far between. Many who want to engage know that, and they disengage as a result, and that's a pity. So here are 6 ideas that we'd like to put forward on how to fix that. 1, start the public consultation process much sooner, preferably as soon as April of next year, not November, as is traditionally the practice. Allow much more time for deliberation than is currently possible. 2, hold more rounds of councillor-led public information sessions. Provide better access to the information needed for folks to have a well-informed and constructive say. 3, measure. It's not exactly it's a meta budget item, if anything, but it's an important one. Set ambitious benchmarks and appropriate metrics, including trend analysis over several years, to better track progress in achieving each of Council's key objectives and, if necessary, to make mid-course corrections. Why ambitious? Because there's ample evidence that it produces better results over time. 4, improve transparency and accountability. How so? By publishing easy-to-grasp data on the city's open data web portal, including infographics and mapping that illustrate key results. 5, clearly link expenditures to council priorities. That's sorely missing from the current budget-making process, and that undermines accountability. 6, tell us why the city makes the budget choices that it makes. The budget tells us how public money is being spent, as well as where and when, but it does not say why. Every budget reflects hard choices and consequential value choices. The underlying reasons for particular choices instead of others should be part of the public consultation, in our view. So, in summary, let's have a more meaningful, broadly based, longer public consultation, public discussion, including discussion about the why. Ultimately, budget decisions are for our elected officials to make and to be accountable for. However, the more transparent and the more collaborative the budget-making process is, and the better informed our elected officials and we are, the better. Thank you. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them afterwards.
Thank you, Roland. Alice, Irene?
Thanks, Roland. Thanks, Paul. And thanks, everyone, for being here today for this important topic. I'm really pleased that we just ended there on speaking about priorities. The budget does speak to our priorities and what matters to us. And there's nothing more than climate action, climate change that affects us and should be a priority for all of us. Between the derecho last year, the canal this year, we are feeling this now. Residents are feeling the impacts already of higher temperatures and worsening climate impacts. And that is why climate really does need to be such a priority in the budget now, but really we're looking at moving forward as well. So we wanted to applaud that there is dedicated funding for climate action in this budget for the first time. We're thrilled to see the $5 million in the budget for climate action. It is noteworthy that it's the first time, and so we want to celebrate that, but we also want to mention and reiterate that it is not nearly enough to fully fund and implement the climate change master plan, including energy evolution and the climate resiliency strategy. These plans are good, they are important, they're vital, and they need to be fully funded now and going into the future. It will require significant investment, but we know that climate change is going to cost us dearly in any scenario, and that by investing, we can see more benefits for residents and protect ourselves from the worst of the climate impacts. So estimates that we need to invest $31.8 billion from now until 2050. This $5 million is a strong step, just the fact that it's there, but we do want to see it increase. That's less than 1% of what we need over the long term. And the more we invest upfront, the more we'll save in the long term. So we would like to see increased funding towards climate action in next year's budget, as well as in this year's budget. And that means significant increases across the board. We also are pleased to have this first step on the climate lens. Identified funding in the budget is helpful for this. It could be refined to be a more valuable tool. So we would like the nature of the climate lens, as we understand it, is essentially a checkbox of 3 things: minor, moderate, or a serious reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But it doesn't allow a review of where emissions are increased or allow anything other than this very basic assessment. So it does need to be fine-tuned, and now is a good time to do that. It's the first time, so we want to make sure that it's being designed properly so that we're really seeing meaningful reductions and that these are measured and tracked as well. So of course, climate is interconnected with so many elements from across the budget beyond the climate change investment itself. This includes nature, biodiversity, green space. It's very connected to transit as well. We know that buildings and transportation are 2 main sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So we do want to speak to those as well, but I know my colleagues from this panel will be speaking to those. So I'll leave those for them to speak about, particularly that connection between climate and nature. So with that, I'll pass it over to Paul.
Thank you, Alice Irene. The Greenspace Alliance of Canada's capital is focused more on trees and wetlands in this budget. Those are the 2 main priority areas that we were looking at, because both are under a special pressure and threat going forward. We can see with the increased infill activity that is planned under Bill 23 that will increase the amount of development that would affect the urban canopy. We need to be very proactive in protecting trees in that context. And also in relation to Bill 23, we know that wetlands are now much more exposed to degradation as a result of a loss of protection there. So we would like to see those two specific items addressed directly in the budget. That would be really two parts of the budget dealing with the natural systems group and the forestry group are the main areas of responsibility here. Both their budgets are status quo, basically, which is good. No cuts, great, but they're basically status quo budgets. They don't really take into account these additional pressures. We would like to see those very specific points addressed in the budget that's presented on Wednesday. What we've heard is that there will be staff reports coming forward on those issues. One on the current status of the urban forest management plan, which is really what guides the urban forest and the protection of trees. We know that we're sort of a little bit behind in the implementation of that plan, and it hasn't been fully funded. We'd like to see commitment to that coming out of this discussion on Wednesday. And as well regarding wetlands, a report is supposed to be coming from staff on the impact of Bill 23 broadly, but also specifically on environmental issues like tree protection and in particular wetland protection. So we'd like to see direction coming from council on those two items going forward. So we'll move on to Angela with cafes.
Okay, thank you very much. I will try to not repeat what has been said already. Overall, despite some comments that this is a belt-tightening budget, it's pretty clear once you look at the numbers that this is in fact a growth budget. It's also has a feel of very much a status quo budget with some increases on the margins, and in many different directions we're seeing the 2.5 plus the 2.2 assessment growth allocation. So we are wondering how the budget then actually is reflecting the new leadership's addressing of the threats and pressures that Ottawa is facing. Much has been made of the need for deeply affordable housing, but we're not seeing an increased allocation to housing. So how can this be? As Alice Irene has already explained, it's nice to have a budget line for climate, but the funding is nowhere near what is required. We understand that Bill 23 represents significant threat financially for the city. But in terms of the coming service level reviews, these are not really positioned to address this threat in terms of the sustainability of funding for our development. So we've long questioned whether growth pays for growth. We have had an update in terms of the development charges review, and we know that growth already under the status quo does not pay for growth. So we have a budget that sets us on continued infrastructure expansion, but doesn't really question where can the city afford to grow. We know that the potholes are enormous in our roads, but we are talking about further expanding our roads and building more roads that after, if you do the math, we know that we won't be able to afford to fix under the current scenario. And squeezing services and cutting a few jobs is not going to be able to make up for these structural drivers. In terms of then looking for efficiencies, we would point to being more cautious in terms of these large capital projects, in terms of road widening, in terms of building in inflation drivers of automatic capital cost increases of 6.3%, having also the automatic infrastructure boosts year on year. So we feel that there are a lot of extravagances in some ways in this budget that are hiding, especially on the capital budget side. And so I'll stop there, and I hope that that presents the budget in a slightly different light.
Then we'll move to Laura with Ottawa Transit Riders.
Hello, thank you. So, excuse me. Basically, I'm here to talk a little bit about the public transit budget today. And while we've heard all of the earlier speakers, generally speaking, talking about climate and environmental issues, public transit is also a climate and environmental issue. We know that in order to have the greener future we want, we need to get cars off the road. We need to get people to be able to make public transit a first and best choice for their trips around town. Not necessarily for every trip, but it needs to be an excellent choice for more and more citizens if we want to see that change happen. And unfortunately, our public transit budget this year shows a $47 million efficiencies cut to our capital spending budget. Now, part of this is, of course, retiring some buses that were high maintenance and that were costing a lot in terms of that maintenance. And while we don't disagree that that may be a very wise choice for the budget, assuming that we've got these electric buses coming and that we are going to look at modernizing our fleet, it still begs the question of how far we can kick the can down the road when it comes to capital infrastructure investments, because it's not simply those buses that we're talking about. It's also the fact that a lot of needed improvements are going to be put off to our stations, to our infrastructure, to our stops. And in many cases, these are improvements that would help riders to make transit a better choice. We know that we're still not addressing the long walks at, for example, Herdman stations and Tunney's pasture stations that make transit more difficult for anyone who faces a mobility challenge. We know we still have many stops around the city that are not physically accessible, not accessible to people who use mobility devices. So all of these issues are challenges, and we know that we need to see these capital investments to not only improve on those, but to maintain the infrastructure we've got instead of letting it waste away, resulting in higher costs in the long term for that maintenance. The other thing I would like to speak to today is with respect to the operating budget. In our city's operating transit budget this year, there is a $39 million hole. And in the budget, it is stated that this hole will be filled by funding from the provincial government. And while I and many other transit advocates absolutely support the provincial government stepping up and providing funds for transit, I believe that it's a massive climate change measure that we need to be doing this, but there has been no promise of these funds. There is no guarantee that this money is coming. And so really what we're looking at is a bit of a wishful thinking budget. We know that should this money not come through, the OC Transpo will try to absorb as much of the cost as possible without starting to cut routes. But we know that a $39 million hole is a big hole, and that should we need to start cuts, it will hurt people. It will make transit a poorer choice. It will hamper us from making those improvements to the network that we need to do in order to make transit a better choice for more people. We're also relying in this budget on a year-round average of 70% of 2019 transit ridership numbers. And that's again a challenge, as we've seen the city overestimate again and again what those ridership numbers should be. And if there happens to be a shortfall, we're at 60% now. So that would mean that as the year goes on, we need to start getting close to 80% of those pre-pandemic ridership levels. If we don't see that make up, there will also be another hole in the budget to account for that ridership number difference. So that's another thing we need to think about is where will this money come from? Because our reserves are not what they should be. We've already dipped into them several times over the past years. And we need to think about how we can have a good quality transit system that meets our needs and, frankly, that is funded in a way that is built for the people who need it. While I'm here, I've also been asked to speak briefly to housing and homelessness issues. We know that one of the emergencies our city has declared is a climate emergency. The other emergency that has been declared is a housing and homelessness emergency. And the current budget is mostly a status quo budget. There are some modest increases to items such as the Community Homelessness Prevention Initiative. And there's some speak as well about improving the housing programs under affordable housing. But the challenge is that we are dealing with a crisis situation. We are dealing with hundreds of people every night laying their head on a bed in a homeless shelter, on a motel, or rough sleeping. And in order to really move the needle, we need to think about the capital investment piece as well. We don't always get all money we want from other levels of government, but the 15 million that the city is putting in has been a stagnant number. And we are seeing massive increases in costs of construction, and we need to be ready to adapt and put our money where our mouths are. And if we really want to turn the corner on this emergency, we need to be willing to invest more upfront in order to be able to draw into those matching funds and to really start moving the needle on housing and homelessness issues. So I'm going to leave it at that and turn it back over to Paul. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. And then we'll finish off with Just Food and Laura Neidhart now.
Great. Thanks so much. This budget shows that Council is not yet investing in a comprehensive municipal food strategy that integrates the concerns of residents, businesses, and organizations across our city, across our food system, who have shown their serious support for action to support good food for everyone in Ottawa. Food insecurity is a major issue today. 1 in 8 households, or about 13.3% in Ottawa, are food insecure, and that number is only rising. Ottawa remains alone as a major city in Canada, coast to coast to coast, without an embedded municipal food strategy. 32 other cities across Canada have invested in coordinated action to address the link between physical and mental health and food, address rising food prices and the serious food insecurity that communities are dealing with, address inequitable access to land, food production, and an edible landscape, provide economic development support to food and farming businesses, and address the circular economy of food waste. Unfortunately, Ottawa remains not doing that. Investing means, similar to these other cities, investing in full-time paid staff within our municipal government to coordinate action and ensure a food lens in policy and programs across departments. It also means full-time paid staff in the community, acknowledging the community's food system expertise. And it means adequately investing in the solutions to prevent food insecurity and prevent business closures instead of providing Band-Aid support thereafter. We need this term of council to prioritize investment into a food strategy that will bring action on these urgent issues. There are multiple municipal levers, responsibilities, and expertise that are not being used, and that failure is leading to serious problems in our community and a gap with other cities that is noticeable. Ottawa has to align with municipal planning worldwide, noting that the Food and Agriculture Organizations has requested a clear focus on urban food systems as a priority to deal with urgent shared challenges. Over 200 other leading large cities worldwide have already invested in this. We need this budget to better reflect people's demand for action on food at our local level.
Thank you, Laura. Now the floor is open to you, guests, and we're happy to answer any questions that you may have.